In the autumn of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire still spoke of Africa as if it were eternal property, grain ships, olive oil, tax revenues, and the prestige of Carthage flowing north as they had for generations. Yet the empire's grip was already turning into something weaker than control, a habit of command without the muscle to enforce it. In the imperial imagination, Africa was a possession. In strategic reality, it was becoming a prize, and when prizes appear, they invite takers. Roman Africa was not just a province. It was a system. Fertile estates worked by peasants, cities tied together by roads, ports feeding the Mediterranean, and administrators converting harvests into taxes and taxes into armies. When that system functioned, it stabilized the Western Empire. When it failed, the West starved politically, militarily, and often literally. That is why the rise of the Vandals in Africa was not a footnote to Rome's decline. It was a turning point in the balance of Mediterranean power, a moment when migrating people transformed themselves into a state, and when Rome learned that losing a province could mean losing the future. The story begins not with a single invasion, but with a long weakening of imperial authority. The 5th century West was still Roman in name, still draped in ceremonies and laws, but increasingly governed by warlords, court factions, and improvisation. Commanders competed with one another. Regions were defended unevenly. Political survival often mattered more than strategic coherence. This was the atmosphere in which whole populations could move across borders and survive. It was also the atmosphere in which the Vandals, already displaced, already hardened by years of war, could conceive of something more than survival. They could conceive of conquest. For decades, the Vandals had been pushed and pulled across the collapsing edge of the Roman world. In 406, they crossed the Rhine as part of a wider movement that shattered Roman security in Gaul. From there, they moved into the Iberian Peninsula, where Roman authority was brittle and contested. The Vandals were not one unified, disciplined army in the modern sense. They were people on the move, families, warriors, dependents surviving through force, negotiation, and opportunism. But the condition that made them dangerous was the same one that made them persistent. They had learned how to live inside a crumbling empire, feeding on its divisions and exploiting its inability to concentrate power. Then came the decisive variable: leadership. In 428, the Vandals came under the direction of Gaiseric, a ruler with a strategic mind and a ruthless patience. He understood that the Western Roman Empire could still punish enemies, but only intermittently. It could still field armies, but often too late, too divided, and too bound by internal politics to finish a campaign. In such a world, the bold were rewarded. Gaiseric's greatest insight was that the Mediterranean itself, Rome's highway of commerce and military movement, could be turned against Rome if one controlled the right ports. Africa was the right port, multiplied into an entire coastline. The reasons the Vandals went to Africa have been debated for centuries, and the argument itself reveals the nature of late Roman politics. One tradition claims that Count Bonifacius, the Comes Africae, invited the Vandals during a quarrel with the imperial court. Britannica repeats the story as a reported claim, while also stressing a more fundamental truth. Africa's wealth was so great that the Vandals likely needed no formal invitation at all, because the province itself was the temptation. Another Britannica entry similarly describes Gaiseric's move to Africa as connected to Bonifacius, but frames it as an evident invitation used in a struggle against imperial authority. The point is not whether a letter was sent or a promise made. The point is that Rome's internal conflict created a doorway, and the Vandals were organized enough to walk through it. In 429, that doorway became a crossing. Gaiseric transported the Vandal people across the Strait of Gibraltar into Africa. Britannica preserves the traditional scale of the movement, describing the whole people, 80,000 inches all, crossing in 429 and advancing with little opposition. In a separate biography, Britannica again notes that Gaiseric transported his people, purportedly 80,000, into Africa. Wikipedia's account places the landing in May 429 near Tingis in modern Morocco and stresses the rapid eastward sweep against weakened Roman defences. Numbers in ancient history are often symbolic, but even as symbols they matter. They tell the listener this was not a raid. It was a relocation with political intent. The Vandals were arriving not to plunder and leave, but to seize a landscape and become its rulers. Once in Africa, the Vandals moved like a force that understood timing. Roman Africa contained fortified cities and a long tradition of urban defense, yet the province's security ultimately depended on Rome's ability to coordinate field armies, hold supply lines, and keep commanders loyal. Those were precisely the capacities late Rome struggled to maintain. The Vandals exploited that weakness with a campaign that combined speed with pressure on key nodes. Wikipedia describes how, after taking control of Mauritania, the Vandals pushed into Numidia, where Bonifacius confronted them near Calama and suffered a severe defeat. After Calama, the conquest became unspooling. Roman authority did not collapse everywhere at once. It retreated into islands of fortification, leaving countryside and roads increasingly exposed. The siege of Hippo Regius became the emblem of that phase. Hippo was not merely a city, it was a center of Christian learning and Roman civic life. When the Vandals besieged it, they did not simply threaten walls, they threatened the continuity of a Roman world that had long believed itself permanent. The siege lasted many months. Augustine, the bishop of Hippo, and one of the most influential Christian thinkers of late antiquity, died during this ordeal, a symbolic coincidence that later writers could not ignore. Wikipedia notes that Augustine died during the 14-month siege. In the dramatic language of history, it is difficult to resist the image, Rome's spiritual giant dying as a new power presses against the city's gates. Yet the deeper reality is colder. The siege demonstrates that the Vandals could conduct sustained operations and that Roman relief efforts were inconsistent and fragile. Rome did send help. Eastern Roman contingents under Aspar became involved, and at points the conflict slowed. But slowing was not stopping. The crucial feature of the war was that it did not produce a clean Roman counter-offensive that drove the Vandals back across the sea. Instead, it produced negotiation. In 435, a treaty acknowledged the new reality and gave the Vandals territory. Britannica describes an agreement in 435 that allotted Numidia and Mauritania Citifensis to the Vandals. Wikipedia likewise describes the 435 peace treaty at Hippo Regius, in which the Vandals agreed to become foederati in return for controlling large portions of Mauritania and Numidia. A Roman state that once dictated settlements now accepted them. That alone should have been a warning that the empire was negotiating from weakness. But Gaiseric treated treaties as tools, not as endings. The Vandals had not crossed into Africa to be Rome's contracted allies. They wanted the center of African power. That center was Carthage. Carthage was more than a city. It was an economic engine and a naval possibility. Its capture would give the Vandals not only administrative authority, but also shipyards, a harbor, and the ability to project force across the sea. This is the moment when the conquest turns from land war into geopolitical transformation. On 19 October 439, Carthage fell. Wikipedia's article on the event states plainly that the city was captured by the Vandals on that date, and that after capturing it, the Vandals sacked the city and made it the new capital of their kingdom. Wikipedia's broader conquest narrative emphasizes that the Vandals attacked Carthage without declaring war and took it without resistance. Britannica frames it as a surprise move that threw off Roman overlordship and struck a devastating blow at imperial power. The convergence of accounts, despite differences in tone, reveals what contemporaries sensed immediately. This was not merely another city lost. This was the loss of Africa's nerve center. How does a great city fall without resistance? The answer is not that Carthage lacked walls or defenders, but that Rome lacked readiness. Armies were elsewhere. Politics absorbed attention. The imperial system was reactive, not proactive, and the Vandals understood how to strike at the moment when reaction would be slowest. Carthage's fall also illustrates a wider pattern. By the 5th century, the empire's strength depended less on institutions and more on individuals, on whether a general was competent, whether troops were loyal, whether a court was unified. When those variables failed, even a great city could be taken like an unlocked storehouse. Once Carthage was in Vandal hands, the meaning of Vandal Africa changed. It was no longer simply a conquered territory, it became a base. This is where the stereotype of the Vandals as mindless destroyers must be treated cautiously. Britannica explicitly argues that the Vandals were probably no more deliberately destructive than other Germanic invaders, even as their establishment had severe consequences. The idea of vandalism is a later cultural invention, not a neutral description of 5th century governance. The Vandals did real damage through war, expulsions, and confiscations, but they also built a functioning kingdom that lasted for generations. Their rule was harsh, often discriminatory, and shaped by religious conflict, yet it was a political order, not a temporary riot. That political order rested on control of land and people. Britannica describes expulsions of landowners in parts of northern Tunisia and the handing of their properties to Vandals. That is conquest in its most material form, not only defeat of armies but redistribution of wealth. Roman Africa's urban life was tied to landowners and their networks. When those elites were displaced, towns suffered. The countryside may continue producing, but the social system that connected production to Roman civic identity was fractured. The Vandals thus changed Africa's internal balance, even as they changed Mediterranean politics. Religion intensified division. The Vandals were Arian Christians, while much of the Roman population followed Nicene Christianity. This created an identity boundary between rulers and subjects. Britannica notes that the Vandals, divided from their subjects by Arianism, exercised pressure on Latin Christians, and that persecution was exaggerated by the victims yet not imaginary. In such conditions, faith was not merely theology, it was politics, an instrument of loyalty and exclusion. A regime that feels surrounded often uses religion to solidify internal unity, even at the cost of social peace. But the most revolutionary consequence of the conquest was naval. From Carthage, Gaiseric could turn Africa's coast into a platform for maritime power. Britannica describes Gaiseric's use of a large fleet to dominate the western Mediterranean and accelerate the breakup of the economic unity of that sea. The biography of Gaiseric similarly notes that his fleet controlled much of the western Mediterranean and that he annexed island territories. In a world where Rome's identity had been tied to the concept of mare nostrum, our sea, the emergence of a rival naval power was psychological warfare as much as strategic warfare. It meant Rome could be threatened not only at borders, but at the coastal arteries that fed its cities and moved its armies. This is why the Vandal takeover of Africa should be understood as a transformation of global power dynamics in late antiquity. A province that once sustained an empire became the engine of an alternative power. And that alternative power did not need to conquer Italy to weaken Rome. It could strangle Rome's resources, disrupt its shipping, and force it into humiliating negotiations. The Vandals did not have to be numerous compared to Rome's total population. They simply had to be positioned at the right choke points, controlling the right ports, at a time when Rome could not mobilize effectively. The conquest also illustrates a truth about imperial collapse. It is often caused as much by internal fragmentation as by external assault. Even the controversy over Bonifacius reflects this. Whether he invited the Vandals or not, the very plausibility of the story shows how late Roman politics worked. Generals treated provinces as personal power bases. Courts treated generals as threats. Loyalty was conditional. In such a system, a province like Africa could become a bargaining chip in conflicts among Romans themselves. And once a province becomes a chip, it can be lost at a table where outsiders are watching. Yet the Vandals were not simply outsiders in the simplistic sense. They were products of the Roman world as much as enemies of it. They had fought Roman armies, negotiated treaties, adopted a form of Christianity, and learned how Roman administration functioned. They were shaped by the imperial system even as they broke it. That is part of what made them effective. They were not strangers to the empire's methods. They could imitate, adapt, and exploit them. Carthage's capture in 439 therefore marks a shift in the narrative of late antiquity. Before that date, Africa is still plausibly Roman, even if threatened. After that date, Africa becomes the capital of a Vandal kingdom, and the Western Empire's map is permanently altered. Wikipedia's capture article emphasizes that the Vandals made Carthage their capital, and that their occupation lasted for decades until later reconquest. The duration matters. A raid leaves scars. A regime leaves institutions, demographic changes, and long-term realignments. Vandal Africa was a regime. The immediate aftermath forced Rome into strategic humiliation. Treaties in 442 recognized Vandal mastery over the most fertile and valuable parts of Roman Africa. Britannica describes that treaty as establishing the Vandals in Africa, Proconsularis, Byzacena, Tripolitania, and parts of Numidia. Wikipedia similarly frames 442 as confirming the Vandals' control over Africa Proconsularis and Byzacena, among other regions, leaving the Romans with reduced holdings. What had been Rome's breadbasket became Rome's loss. And because African wealth was central to funding armies, this loss fed back into Rome's wider decline, making the empire even less capable of preventing future losses. From here, the Vandals' position becomes a study in asymmetric advantage. They held a rich province. They held a strategic harbor. They could strike across the sea. And Rome, deprived of African resources, struggled to respond. Even when Rome attempted countermeasures, the wider crises of the 5th century, Hunnic pressure, Persian conflicts in the east, internal politics in the west, repeatedly diverted attention. Wikipedia notes that an Eastern Roman fleet prepared to attack Carthage in the early 442s, but withdrew due to hostilities elsewhere. The Vandals did not need to defeat every Roman plan. They only needed to survive long enough for Rome's distractions to do the rest. The conquest's legacy is therefore double-edged. On one side, it represents the collapse of Roman domination in Africa and the suffering that conquest brings. War, displacement, coercion, religious persecution, and economic disruption. On the other side, it demonstrates that so-called barbarian peoples were capable of strategic statecraft, long-term planning, and the construction of durable political orders. The Vandals did not accidentally stumble into Africa. They targeted it, moved an entire population to seize it, negotiated when necessary, struck decisively when opportunity appeared, and then converted territorial control into naval power. Britannica calls Gaiseric perhaps the most perceptive barbarian king of the 5th century for recognizing the empire's weakness and rejecting formal alliance in favor of dominance. Whether one admires or condemns him, the historical result is clear. He understood the age he lived in, and he built a kingdom from its ruins. In the end, the rise of the Vandals in Roman Africa is a warning carved into the history of empires. A province can be wealthy and still vulnerable. A city can be famous and still fall. A state can claim legitimacy and still lack the force to defend it. When internal rivalries corrode strategic unity, the border is no longer a line on a map, it becomes a suggestion. And when the sea is no longer ours, it becomes contested space, where power belongs to whoever controls ports, ships, and timing. Roman Africa was once the West's foundation. Under the Vandals, it became the West's nightmare because it proved that Rome could be defeated not only on distant frontiers, but at the very source of its strength. That is what the Vandals took when they took Africa. They took land, yes, and cities, yes, but more importantly, they took the imperial advantage of certainty. They replaced it with a new reality. In the 5th century Mediterranean, Rome no longer decided who would rule the future.